also Kashmir, for example. We've always Palestinians and generally the oppressed in the global South, all over. We've always understood that Western powers don't really believe the adjectives and the values that they claim, because they've demonstrated that to us. These values of democracy and human rights, etc. Because they'll say things, but then they come into our lands and commit extraordinary atrocities and brutality and just massive theft of natural resources and of labor. And but until Ukraine happened, until the invasion of Ukraine, we really they always could claim otherwise, right? But suddenly, when there was when their interests aligned with armed resistance and what they would ordinarily call terrorism if we did it, right? When we've had uprisings and thrown Molotov cocktails or rocks at this nuclear armed military that's invading our neighborhoods, we were always called terrorists and savages and whatnot. But suddenly it was all of these acts that we had been doing in self-defense and righteous resistance is suddenly it's heroic. And you saw all of these. I mean, the propaganda around Ukraine garnered participation from every aspect of Western societies, not just the governments, but corporations, the media. I mean, it was like everybody was like got a memo and everybody was just following the script. Facebook and Instagram literally changed their hate speech rules to allow Ukrainians or people everywhere to incite violence against Russians. Suddenly it was okay to call for violence as long as Russia was the target. On the other hand, Palestinians merely revealing and exposing Israeli brutality, right? Not even calling for violence or resistance against Israel, just exposing them. We had our accounts shut down across the board on the claim that these things will cause violence, right? They'll incite violence. If people got angry enough, they're going to incite violence. And this hypocrisy was on full display. And even we heard the media, they couldn't even help themselves, right? They were even saying, well, this isn't supposed to happen in Europe. This is only supposed to happen to Arabs and Africans and brown people and Black people, right? They weren't even trying to be subtle about it. So I, for one, am glad for, that this hypocrisy is exposed and they really have no leg to stand on anymore when they start calling us terrorists or when we call for armed resistance, which is frankly all right, because the balance of violence is massively against us. I mean, we are the ones who are the targets and recipients of violence, really, and terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism.
I've always been greatly impressed by your clarity around subject matter, Susan, and what you bring to the table in terms of all of your discussions around issues. And one of the things is that in your writings, Your writings are not just writings for entertainment. Your writings is not just, but it really sort of carries forth a message. And that message is very well constructed, is done in a very powerful way because you are an author. I want to let folks know you've gotten several books out there. And so those books have continued to speak to the heart and speak to the minds of people. And when we talk about it, one of your books is Mornings in Janine. Another one is Against a Loveless World and the Blue Between Sky and Water. And I want you to tell us a little bit about the influences that help you to form these stories, because they're really not separate from what you're talking about right now in terms of the issues around Palestine and the contradictions. Will you just share a little bit about that for us?
Yeah, so first of all, you mentioned the word entertainment. I want to be clear that this idea that art is, or even sports, is somehow separate from politics or reality really is an exclusively Western idea. Nowhere else in the world do people conceive of a separation between art and politics, or art and socioeconomic conditions or social justice. And especially when you come from a community of struggle, the things we write about come from this collective wound, right? Like we, individuals, as individuals, we all go through hardships in life. But when you are part of a society that has been collectively oppressed in some way, you share this kind of collective, this landscape, this artistic landscape of wounds and pain that you create from. So of course, everything I write is coming from that perspective. They are, their individual lives are fictional lives, but everything about their lives is real. Everything about the historic context that they move through is real and documented. So I'm not, I don't ever write with the idea that I'm going to have a message. Like that's not ever on my mind. But of course, that's going to be, there's going to be an organic sort of production in that way, but that isn't my intention. We're a nation, we're an ancient society that's literally being wiped off the map, and our history and Israeli colonialism, it differs from traditional colonialism in that they are trying to indigenize themselves. They are claiming our food as their own. They're claiming our culture as theirs. They're claiming our history as theirs, our archaeology, everything. And what they cannot reasonably claim, they've destroyed. So including, destroying Muslim and Christian cemeteries, destroying archaeology that has nothing to do with Judaism. And it's been this systematic, persistent erasure since the invention of Israel in 1948. So because my characters are all Palestinian, they live in that context. And so readers get to see that history, which is frankly denied to Western societies from popular media. It's really only been a recent phenomena that publishers will even publish our books, or translate them. Usually it's been white people explaining us. And even to this day, you see the novels that really get a lot of money and hype behind them are written by white people. And it's not just with Palestinians. That's with Black people. You get books like the help, or with Mexican people, you get like that, forget the name of it, that book that was written by a white lady explaining a migrant's journey. But that's, and those are the books that get all the hype and all the publicity, and get through all the gatekeepers. So we're still dealing with that. But with Palestinians, it's to a much larger extent.
Stories have been born in you, I could say, born in you by a legacy of displacement and the history that goes with that. Where were you born?
I was born in a refugee camp in Kuwait.
And that's a part of your story.
Absolutely,
in terms of that, right? And so it's like when, and I'm glad you talked about when you organically sit down to begin to write. It's not that you have plotted out a message, but you're reaching down into that well of experience and the story
Sure.
that you're born, right? It's somewhat like I do when I preach, right? The preparation for it reaches down into a well of experience to tell the truth. And so you tell the truth. And that's one thing that moves me. But I'm so impressed, Susan, I need to say this. I'm impressed by the depth and the width of the story that is in you that comes out on the page. And sometimes I sit there as I've read your novels and I say, wow, where did that story come from? Because in some ways, you got passages that are deeper than deep, if I can put that out there like that, that reaches down into a place that is, I think, touches the soul of humanity. And tell us a little bit about that process, because I know when you wrote Mornings of Janine, what happened to get you there?
Well, first of all, thank you for that. I'm not a trained writer, actually. I was a scientist before I became a writer, but I became a writer during around the second Intifada, when I was kind of enraged by the way that the media was portraying what I already knew and understood. And it was so spun and so mendacious and false. And I just actually started just writing letters to the editor. And then I started writing op-eds. And around the time that a lot of my articles were getting picked up, I went to Palestine when there was an ongoing massacre in Jenin. The Israeli military basically invaded the refugee camp of Jenin with their full force. And they went in and literally razed whole sections of that camp with, basically burying people inside the rubble of their homes. And it was extraordinary carnage. And I happened to be one of the first international, quote, I'm Palestinian, but I don't live in Jenin. And so I was one of the first people who went into Jenin immediately after the Israeli military lifted the closure. In fact, we were able to sneak in just the night before. And what I witnessed, I've grown up in a family that closely followed the news. And so, images of massacres, whether it was the Sabra and Shatila massacres that, Israel orchestrated in Lebanon. And so gruesome images were not, foreign to me, but it was an entirely different matter to actually be there and to smell it, basically, like just rotting corpses under the rubble that people couldn't get to. You knew they were there. You could, it was just this this dismal place and energy that changed my life. It was it really altered the course of my life. And in the midst of that just unbelievable pain and confusion and heartache and just horrors, people were still taking care of each other. I mean, it was stunning, and they were still defiant. I remember there was people didn't have water. They were short on food. Water was really scarce, and it was hot. It was in April, and this truckload of water was coming into the camp, and it was from USAID, USAID. And literally people in the camp just lined up, linked arms, and refused to let that truck in, basically saying, we don't want your water. You just finance this carnage here. You just, killed hundreds of us, and now you're going to bring us water to, go home. And I'm just, trying not to use expletives here.
Yes.
But,
yes.
but, so there was still that pride and defiance, and then people were helping each other dig through the rubble of their homes. I volunteered with some folks in the Red Cross. They were all, they're not the Red Crescent. They were all volunteers digging corpses out of the rubble. There were, that too was, really. Just really never left me, those images that kind of still play in my mind, even as we're talking right now.
Mm-hmm.
But, so, and I came back to the US. I was a single mom of my daughter was very, very young at the time. And I was paycheck to paycheck. I wasn't making much money. And I just didn't know what to do. Like, I did not want to be in this job in that corporation that I worked for. And eventually, like, the bosses at my job had been, unbeknownst to me, were getting quite angry about, seeing my articles appearing in major newspapers and things like that. I was still at that time very naive, thinking that, freedom of speech, no matter what, people can disagree. I still kind of had that stupid idea. Yes. That a lot of Americans, that illusion that a lot of Americans believe and live under. But of course, that's not true, and that's not the reality. And people with power will, they set the tone for what you're allowed to say and think and whatever. And so I lost my job because of that. And I was terrified. It was, like I said, I didn't have any money. I don't have family in this country. I didn't have anything to fall back on. And I had this kid. So the first day I just cried. I just did nothing but cry. And then of course I got cried out, and you can only cry for so long. So the next day I got up. It was just before Christmas. It was December 22nd. And I just started writing about Janine, about what I had witnessed, thinking I was going to write an article, but I just kept writing. And at some point I realized I was going to write a novel, and I was going to write a story.
Wow.
Yeah. And, it was, from then, like, I just went into massive debt. I borrowed money left and right to keep doing that. And, it was a long journey, but, it was a little bit, now that I think back, with a little bit more, with different eyes and older eyes, I realized how crazy and maybe irresponsible it was for me to do that. But it turned out all right.
It worked out, right? It worked out. And that's been translated all over the world. Mm-hmm. That's pretty incredible. If you're just tuning in to us, this is What's at Stake. I'm Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler, your host every second Wednesday of the month. It's 89.3 FM. We are talking with Susan Abulhawa, a Palestinian-American author, novelist, poet, and advocate for justice. And I'm going to ask you, Susan, where do you see flickers of hope for Palestine? And is the tide changing in terms of public opinion about Israel?
So I've always seen hope. And our young people, our old people, everybody in Palestine continues to resist Israel. As long as we are all resisting, there's hope. None of us I mean, this is our ancestral home. I mean, all of our ancestors are buried there. Unlike these Zionists who are coming from Europe and Ukraine and Brooklyn and every other place, our parents and grandparents and great grandparents are buried there. They are the ones who built all those ancient homes that that these Westerners are now claiming are theirs, that they stole. So it's none of us are willing. We're not going to betray our ancestors in that way. We're not going to betray our children by giving up. And so we all resist in any way that we can, and we will continue to do that.
Do you see any?
This is an indigenous people's liberation struggle, full stop. And it's being waged against one of the most powerful militaries in the world that is literally backed politically, militarily, and financially by the world's superpower, the United States. And we are an unarmed, principally unarmed, indigenous civilian population. So that's how extraordinary the imbalance of power really is. And yet we're still here, and so that's a lot, that's huge. Despite it's easy sometimes to get demoralized, but I always remind myself of that. And yes, the tides are turning, at least in the West, and which is where we have been doing a lot of the work over the years. In part because, technology has exposed Israel in ways that they cannot control. Israel is an apartheid state. I mean, and frankly, the word apartheid is too kind for what they're doing. I mean, even in their worst hour, apartheid white supremacists in South Africa never, flew air bombers and dropped death from the skies the way that Israel does persistently. Even, in South Africa, people were safe in their townships. They could move around. There's no place that Palestinians are safe. And Israel invades and continues to invade every inch of Palestine whenever they want. And then they're brutal and they get away with it. And in fact, not only do they get away with it, but extraordinarily, the world cheers it on. What Russia is doing in Ukraine is not even a fraction of what Israel does and has been doing for decades. So yeah, we'll keep on.
We'll keep it up. That's right. And we're going to take a short break. You're listening to What's at Stake, WPFW FM 89.3. I'm Reverend Graylin Scott Hagley, your host every second Wednesday of the month. We're talking to Susan Abulhawa, a Palestinian-American author, novelist, poet, and advocate for justice. And we're going to take a break for our community calendar. And when we come back, we're going to invite you to join in the discussion. Call in 202-588-0893, 202-588-0893, and join us in the discussion.
This is Rev Yearwood, and I am so excited to announce our new climate show, Think 100% Climate Friday. This show will keep you up to date on everything climate justice related in a rapidly changing world. We will discuss breaking news and updates on environmental issues, the climate crisis, COVID-19, and politics. This show will make tangible how the climate crisis has already impacted our lives and what you can do about it. So tune in every Friday at 9:00 a.m. right here on WPFW 89.3 your jazz and justice station.
Peace. I'm DJ Underdog, inviting you to join me on Black Star Radio Mondays, 10 p.m. to midnight, beginning April 19th. We share the hottest sounds out of Africa from all corners of the motherland and bring you the sound of the African underground to DC and all points in between. Together, we'll explore African genres from Amapiano, Genge, Coupe de Calle, Zouk, Lingala, Ethiopian hits, Soukous, Nigerian hits, Egyptian hits, and Afro beats. The destination is Africa, and the mission is oneness. Journey with us Mondays at 10 p.m. right here on WPFW, building a better world, one broadcast at a time. Peace.
Welcome back. This is Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler on What's at Stake, WPFW 89.3. I'm your host every second Wednesday of the month, and we are speaking with Susan Abulhawa, a Palestinian-American author, novelist, poet, and advocate for justice. We're inviting you to join in the discussion. You can dial 202-588-0893, 202-588-0893. I'm also been notified by some of my leaders to announce that on July 24th at 12 noon, a dialogue at Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ, a radical perspective on the roots of current threats to our rights, reproductive justice, voting rights, policing, militarism, etc., at 5301 North Capitol Street, Northeast Washington, D.C. And we are joining with Susan. Susan, again, we're just going to ask you because I know that you have been really an internationalist, I could say. When I say internationalist, is someone who has linked many of the struggles around the world. What do you see in terms of similarities to what's going on in Palestine to what's taking place in the U.S., for example?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I thank you for bringing that up because, yes, our struggles are linked in so many ways, not just within this country, but throughout the world. Just as Black liberation is linked to liberation struggles around the world, so are our oppressors linked around the world. So there's this really great project that was just launched. It's called the Mapping Project, the Boston Mapping Project. People can Google it to check it out. And they basically draw lines on a map. It's an interactive map connecting funders with in the United States with various institutions that are involved in oppression of Black Americans and oppression of Palestinians and violators of various laws and human rights laws, etc. So it's, these lines are, it's really the first of its kind, and this project is stunning, and the proof that it's potent is the fact that it was immediately attacked by the ADL, and the ADL, with all their pull, were able to get the FBI to start investigating it as an anti-Semitic hate site or something like that, when in fact, actually, they are targeting mostly police stations because and police institutions because a lot of police departments that do what they do in this country are trained in Israel. As a matter of fact, the ADL, along with the Jewish Federation, fund these completely free training junkets with the Israeli military. So police chiefs in this country and police officers go to Israel to train with an occupying military that has been accused by nearly every major human rights organization of war crimes. So they take that training and they bring it and apply it here. Now, that's not to say that, racist police, need any kind of special training to do their racist stuff. They've been doing it for centuries here. But the fact is that there is a cross-pollination, and they are getting a lot of their tactics now and their methods from Israel. So that's the kind of cross-pollination between the people who are oppressing us. And of course, there's liberation struggles around the world are linked no matter what. It's kind of like, when Nelson Mandela said, our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinians. Our struggle was linked with the South African liberation struggle. Back in the day, I know you can remember, and we're old enough to remember the non-aligned movement, right? When there was this inspiring leftist guerrilla movements all over the world, liberation movements from Algeria to South Africa to Palestine, to the Black Panthers, and all of these organizations found common cause together, and they met with each other, and they trained with each other, and they exchanged tactics and information and inspiration. And if you go to, like, for Palestinians, like, a lot of our heroes aren't just Palestinian heroes and martyrs, but people like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali are you'll see folks like that adorning our walls. Certainly they're adorning my walls in my house. People like Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara from Burkina Faso, and so yeah.
If you remember, when I took a group of Black preachers to Palestine in 2016, you ended up assigning me and those preachers a mission, right? So I'm gonna call you Bishop Susan now, and we went somewhere and we dedicated a monument that had been assisted in being put up by Playgrounds for Palestine. Can you tell us what was on that monument and the story around that?
Yes. Many years ago, I established a children's organization. So it's an all-volunteer children's charity. Our mission is quite simple. We build playgrounds for Palestinian kids in refugee camps and in other places in Palestine and outside of Palestine in camps. So we around the time that Tamir Rice was shot at a playground, there was another Palestinian boy, his name was Abdurrahman Ubaidallah. He was likewise shot by a sniper near a playground. And the parallels were shocking and striking. They were around the same age. They were both killed by uniformed white supremacists. And so we brought these two together in a memorial sculpture that we created. There was a painting of both young men. We obtained the photo that Tamir Rice's mother preferred, and we just kind of put them together in this one sculpture to memorialize them and to show solidarity from Palestinians, from Palestinian liberation struggle to the Black liberation struggle, from our children to Black children. We were really happy that it was just very fortuitous that you and other Black preachers had been in Palestine at that time. And so thank you for sort of presiding over that and leading a prayer and for that. And it was installed in the Haida refugee camp in a place called the Ladji Center. If anybody happens to be in Palestine, that's where it is.
Yes, yes. And if you want to join in the discussion, I invite you to call 202-588-0893, 202-588-0893. And to point out sort of the kind of relationship, the parallels that exist that continue to be identified is something that is important, because we are always conditioned to think about our struggle as being unique and therefore not related to somebody else's struggle, when really the sort of the models of oppression are generally the same. They get tweaked here and they get tweaked there, but it comes out to the same formula of how you degrade a people, oppress a people, exploit a people, dispossess a people. I want to invite a caller we got on the line to join in the discussion. Good morning, caller. Welcome to What's at Stake.
Good morning. I would just like to hit a couple points that the author has provided, and she stated the establishment of Israel in 1948. And the world divided, gave the Palestinians a portion, Israel a portion, basically dividing a whole loaf of bread into two halves. And the Israelis have, turned that half a loaf of bread over many times. Now they're selling whatever high tech, the whole bit. And the Palestinians were bent on continuing to fight for all of the land. And I think their leadership hasn't done them well. The Saeb Erekat, the Anas Shawaris, and Mahmoud Abbas, and the late Arafat, they just, haven't shown themselves, I think, and they're smart people. Everybody knows that. And but they haven't shown themselves capable of building statehood and doing those things that show that you're trying to live amiably with other people. And
thank you so much.
Sad for that.
Thank you so much. Go ahead. We got one more. Go ahead.
Please, thank you. And so I think until they identify their leadership and from the bottom up, that they need a change there, they're going to be hampered. And lastly, they pulled out of Gaza and they left businesses there for the Palestinians who worked in those businesses. Yeah, and they tore their businesses down and put up rocket launchers. And
okay, let me stop you there. Let me stop you there because you're buying into literature and to a rationale that is not the reality on the ground. I'm going to ask Susan to answer to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it sounds like your caller has bought into the propaganda totally. I would just like to say that, similar things have been said about Black people, right? They would say, like, and to this day, and for as long as since abolition, they would say, well, Black people are free now, but they still can't get their lives together. And then, after civil rights, so well, they have civil rights now, but look at them, they're still they're killing each other. They're in gangs and they're just that way. This is colonial propaganda. This is colonial narrative, no matter where it is. This is how oppressors talk, and this is what they convince you of. Okay. And there's never mention, of course, of the fact that there was a system in place that would not allow Black people to advance economically. There were deliberate programs in place to spy on Black liberation movements and to infuse and inject drugs and heroin and horrors into Black neighborhoods. Amen. There was a system designed to make sure that Black children did not get a good education and that they would go from schools to prisons. There is a system that does that.
Susan, I'm gonna go sorry. Hold on, I'm gonna go to another caller because we don't spend too much time with this caller who's filled with some kind of Zionist ideology. Caller, welcome. You're on the air.
Good morning. This is Brishat calling. Thank you so much, Reverend Hagler. Thank you, my sister Susan, You're just speaking such powerful truths, and I really, really appreciate it. And it heartens me, even though, my heart breaks every day for what is happening to the Palestinian people and what is happening to, folks in the African diaspora and on the motherland. I wanted to ask you, or, just to really explore a bit more, what is it that folks are doing to deal with the constant trauma of being, under assault in every possible way, culturally, politically, economically, with militarism and that level of violence, stealing, continuing to steal land, because I think that there's something there. And I hope and believe that there's something that we can do that will, we'll call our other brothers and sisters in and have them be a part of a unified struggle to throw off this oppression. So I'm just wondering, what is being done in terms of having people to stay whole and, with, and their spirits, willing and ready to do this work together.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you very much. Susan, make your answer brief because I want to get to some other callers on the line.
Okay. First of all, thank you, my sister Bridget, for your heartening words. We take heart in each other. We're people of deep faith and deep commitment to our history and our ancestors, but we are traumatized. We are a deeply traumatized society, and especially, people in Gaza, for example, like there's studies showing that an extraordinary percentage, like 98 point something percent of Palestinian children under the age of 5 suffer from PTSD. They revert to bedwetting at 12 years old because these are generations that have known nothing but economic siege and persistent Israeli bombardment attacks on a principally defenseless society. So we are traumatized, but we also come from a society that has large families and extended tribes, and so that has been the biggest thing that keeps us whole are these family connections and large family connections. I mean, it is true in our society that children are raised by a village, and that's the social structure, which Israel, by the way, understands and is constantly trying to attack, and in part by dividing villages in multiple ways so that people can't access each other. I mean, it's diabolical when you actually look at the details of what they do to dismantle Palestinian society, basically.
Thank you, Susan. And we got another call. I'm gonna go to that caller. Good morning. You're welcome to What's at Stake.
Yes, good morning, Reverend Hagler. And yes, can you hear me?
Yep, good to have you here.
Okay, I'm an activist from 1963 at South Carolina State College. So you're preaching to the choir. My question is, when I hear programs like this, either with the Palestinians or with other groups, I never hear them mention my Native American brothers and sisters. I mean, if you ever want to look at a model of extermination, we got one, and I just don't hear that as much. So
right.
Can you respond to that?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's actually that's something I've written about. I mean, the parallels between Palestinian extermination, basically, and Indigenous American extermination. The ways there are actually a lot more parallels in that example, in the ways that white colonizers in this country exterminated the buffalo. Israeli colonizers are uprooting millions of olive trees. In both instances, these are things that are spiritually, culturally, integral to our societies, and they are our major food sources. So that's one parallel. Another parallel is the way that white colonizers would sign an agreement, and then, just to buy time to get more settlers, etc., and then they would break the agreement and bring their armies in. Israel does the same thing. They sign agreements to buy time to get more settlers in, more colonizers, get bigger numbers, and then they break the agreements and do what they want with their military. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Excellent, excellent. I think we do have another call on the line. I want to just open the lines. Come on, caller. Welcome to What's at Stake.
Thank you. I appreciate this discussion. Would you please spell the last name of your guest and provide one or two titles of her books?
Yes.
Thank you.
It's Abulhawa. Susan's her first name, and one is Mornings in Janine. Another book is Against a Loveless World, and then the other one that I know of is The Blue Between Sky and Water.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You have any other questions? Thank you. Any other calls, Michael? All right, we're good. We're good. And we're getting close to our ending of our show. But I just want to also lift up a few things that I think is important, is that, Susan, as you sort of like continue to work around these issues, I mean, I know that you've been active in the Philadelphia area around the symphony doing its tour, but also you've been also active with a lot of the various Black organizations that's been doing political organizing in and around Philadelphia. And you continue to be engaged in terms of having a much wider perspective, very poignant in terms of Palestine, but a much wider perspective than just Palestine, because I think from my perspective and understanding of you, you see it as all woven together. And therefore, it is up to us as people of justice that we begin to attack the whole thing in order to change it, transform it, and bring it down. And I think that sometimes people want to reform something that is inherently evil. You can't reform something that's inherently evil, where evil is in its DNA. You have to attack it, you have to take it on, you have to be willing to dismantle it. Can you respond to that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. I don't see a lot of separation, and they are inextricably linked, period. I'm very active in, for example, the Free Mumia movement in Philadelphia, and the Black and Brown Collective. I'm also a member of Workers' World. So all of these things are linked, and even there are. I mean, I find greater common ground with these comrades in this struggle than I do with, for example, wealthy Palestinians who might, be sort of integrated into the privileged part of this of American society, and have, some of whom espouse chauvinistic and racist views as well. So I think, my struggle and my allegiances are not across national lines. They are across human lines. They are across lines of people of the oppressed, period. And so we fight against oppressors, and they come in different forms. And we live in an increasingly multi-ethnic, multiracial white supremacy. I mean, if that makes sense, and I hope it makes sense to people, that, and this is something that Frantz Fanon spoke about, that so many people in oppressed classes aspire to power by, and in their view, it's sort of integrating themselves to get a seat at the table, as it were. But that table is corrupt. That table is working against us. It's working against. And so by just getting Black and brown faces on that table doesn't mean that we're getting justice. It just means that there's Black and brown faces at the table, and that table is really oppressive, and it's really and it's beating down workers, it hates the poor, it hates us, and it doesn't want to see us in power. It doesn't want to see true justice, because there's a lot of money in oppression. There's a whole prison industry. There's a whole war industry. There's a whole theft and exploitation industry. It's worth trillions of dollars. Justice isn't profitable. And that's why, and I think people have to understand that. And it isn't just, Palestinian liberation is wrapped into indigenous liberation. It's wrapped into Black liberation. It's wrapped into environmental justice. It's wrapped into animal rights. It is all together. And in my mind, none of these things can be separated. And
Right.
there are, even within Palestinian liberation, we also wage our own struggles of liberation against internal chauvinism and patriarchy, in the same way that every liberation struggle has to wage its own internal battles. And so, yeah, I'm one person, but that's how my brain constructs what I see.
Amen. Amen. You've been listening to Susan Abulhawa, a journalist, a novelist, journalist, I could say, one that is a writer and social justice advocate who has been speaking with us on what's at stake. We're just about out of time, but I want to say this before we sign off. I want to say to one of the callers that called in, be careful what you read. Be careful what you let yourself be indoctrinated with. You need to take a look at the facts on the ground. For example, you mentioned Gaza and rockets. Well, you shouldn't be talking about Gaza being an open air prison where people are imprisoned by the Israeli forces, where children are even killed for going to the beach. You need to talk about those types of things, and not killed by Palestinians, but killed by Israelis. So in a sense, you need to really understand what the facts are on the ground before you mouth things that are given to you as a part of a propaganda machinery. And that's my urging to all of us, is to begin to read sources and read from credible sources, and to engage in an understanding from that perspective. I want to thank you, Susan Abulhawa, for joining with us this morning on What's at Stake. I think it's been a great discussion, and I look forward to having you back and being with you again as you continue to share your very clear and powerful word with all of us. And so if you have been tuning in, I want to thank you, the audience, for joining me this morning. I want to thank Susan Abulhawa for joining me this morning, the author of Mornings in Janine, the Blue Between Sky and Water, and Against the Loveless World. I thank you, the audience, for joining me. I look forward to being with you again on the second Wednesday of the month. I would like to thank our engineer, Michael Nasala, and the entire WPFW community. I can't wait to be with you again. Be empowered, be uplifted, and be blessed, knowing that we have a lot to get done, and we will do it. Bless y'all.